For years, Bill Gaither chose his words with the kind of care that comes from decades of ministry. Thoughtful pauses, gracious deflections, a smile that held something back. But in a recent conversation his closest circle clearly never expected to become public. He said something he had never said before, something that reframes everything fans thought they understood about why Guy Penrod walked away from the Gaither Vocal Band at the height of his career. What Guy confirmed separately, in his own moment of rare transparency, fills in the rest, and the gospel community has been circling this story for 15 years without ever landing on the full truth of it. By the 10-minute mark of this video you will understand why two men bound by decades of music, faith, and something closer than most professional relationships ever become, kept certain things quiet for as long as they did, and what Bill Gaither, at 82 years old, finally felt the time had come to say out loud. Stay with us, because what comes out in the second half is something this community has been waiting a long time to hear. Some voices do not simply perform a song, they become it. They settle into a melody and make it feel like the words were written for that specific throat, as if the song spent years waiting for the right person to carry it. Guy Penrod carries one of those voices, a baritone that is deep and warm and unhurried, the kind that seems to rise from somewhere beneath the stage before the microphone even has time to do its job. For millions of fans who found gospel music through the Gaither Homecoming video series, Guy was never simply a member of the Gaither Vocal Band. He walked onto those stages, whether a small church hall or a packed arena, with a quiet authority that drew the eye before he opened his mouth, and when he did, whatever was running through your mind went quiet. The people standing near him on those stages showed it on their faces every time. Guy joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 1994, and within a few seasons, it had become genuinely difficult to picture the group without him. His range moved from a chest-deep rumble into a soaring upper register that could bring an auditorium to stillness, and beyond the technical ability there was always the spirit driving it. Guy sang like a man who meant every syllable, because the faith behind the music was not a performance, it was the engine. The recordings he made with the vocal band during those years became touchstones for an entire generation of gospel music listeners. Tracks like Redeemed and I Will Go On, his solos on the Homecoming live recordings, people played those tapes and DVDs on Sunday afternoons at home, shared them with aging parents, carried them into hospital rooms. Guy Penrod's voice became woven into the devotional life of a huge portion of this audience in a way that very few artists ever achieve, and then in 2008, he stepped away. The explanation offered at the time was gracious and uncomplicated. Guy wanted to be home for his family. He and his wife Angie were raising 10 children, and the road, as anyone who has spent years on it will tell you, extracts a price that never shows up on the booking calendar. That explanation was accepted, it was believed, and in many ways it was true. What it was not, it turns out, was the whole truth. For 15 years, Bill Gaither never filled in the rest. Until now. To understand what Bill recently said, and why it carries the weight it does, the relationship between these two men deserves more than a passing mention. This was not an employer and a hired voice. What developed between Bill Gaither and Guy Penrod over nearly 15 years of recording, touring, and building something genuinely lasting together grew into something far closer and far more layered than a professional arrangement. Over the years following Guy's departure, Bill spoke warmly about him at homecoming events, whenever fans called out for him. Always the right words, always with genuine affection, but always with that same quality behind the warmth, as if the full sentence ran longer than the one he chose to finish. Fans who followed this ministry closely enough noticed, the gospel community noticed. Questions lingered that never quite got answered. Was the parting as smooth as it appeared from the outside? Were there conversations behind closed doors that shaped the decision in ways the public was never given access to? Guy himself gave interviews over the years about the toll of the road, the peace that came with stepping back, what it meant to be present for his children in a way the touring schedule had made nearly impossible. Those interviews were honest, and they were real, but they too left something unspoken at the edges. Unspoken things, though, do not disappear, they wait. What Bill said recently did not come in a formal interview setting. It came in the kind of conversation that happens when a man of 82, someone who spent a lifetime choosing his words with great precision, arrives at a point where the cost of that precision begins to feel less urgent than the need for honesty. Stay with us, because what he said, placed side by side with Guy's own words from a separate conversation, changes the shape of everything that came before it. Longtime fans of the homecoming recordings may remember a specific moment, and many will know exactly the one, where a camera catches Bill Gaither watching Guy Penrod sing. Not conducting, not leading, just watching. The expression on his face is difficult to name precisely. Pride, yes, but something more protective than pride, something almost parental, though Bill would likely deflect that word if you offered it to him. That look matters now, because what Bill recently shared suggests that the years following Guy's departure carried a personal weight for him that no one around him fully understood at the time. In the conversation that has since moved through circles close to the Gaither ministry, Bill spoke with an openness that people who know him well describe as unusual, even for someone entering the reflective season of his 80s. He acknowledged that when Guy left, grief settled in, his own word, not an interpretation. Genuine grief of the kind that arrives when a chapter of something you built with your own hands closes before you expected it to. But that was not the confession. The part that changes things is what Bill said about the period leading up to Guy's departure, about conversations the public never had access to, about what he recognized in Guy long before any announcement was made. Bill's account describes Guy coming to him not with a resignation, but with a confession of his own, telling him that the road was not simply taking time from his family. Something else was being taken, something Guy said he could not yet name, but knew he could not keep losing, and Bill said that when those words landed, he already knew the rest before Guy finished the sentence. He told him to go. This is where the story takes a turn that no one in his circle expected to become part of the public record. The narrative surrounding Guy Penrod's departure had always been shaped, understandably, around family. And that was true, and it remains true. His children needed their father, and choosing to be present for them in the way the schedule had made impossible reflected exactly the priorities this community understands and honors. None of that changes. What Bill's words now reveal is that the story did not originate with a scheduling conflict. It began with something quieter and harder. A man recognizing with painful clarity that the life he was living, even a life in service of music he loved and faith he genuinely held, was wearing away something he could not afford to keep losing. Going to Bill Gaither with that truth, trusting him with it, required a kind of courage that rarely gets acknowledged in the way it deserves. Bill did not receive that conversation as a loss, not in the moment. By his own account, he received it as the right thing, and he told Guy clearly that his first responsibility was not to the vocal band, not to the ministry, not to the tours or the recordings or the audiences who would miss him. His first responsibility was to the person he was made to be, and to the family he had been given to care for. And then Bill did something that very few people in his position would have done. He made it easy. He made it clean. The departure did not carry the kind of weight that would have followed Guy into everything that came next, and that was not an accident. Bill protected the narrative, not to manage appearances, but because he loved Guy Penrod and had no interest in allowing a single unnecessary shadow to fall on what came next for him. That is the confession. Underneath a transition that looked clean and professional and gracious on the surface, there ran a depth of relationship and a depth of sacrifice on both sides that the public record never reflected. Guy, speaking separately in his own recent conversation without knowledge that his words would eventually be placed beside Bill's, confirmed the shape of all of this. He described leaving as the hardest right decision he had ever made, and he spoke about the day he walked into that conversation with Bill expecting resistance and receiving instead something he called the most Christlike response I have ever been shown in a professional setting. He was not describing politeness, he was not describing a generous public statement or a gracious handoff. He was describing being fully seen by someone who had every earthly reason to hold on and being released anyway. For those who have followed Guy Penrod's journey through the years, what Bill recently shared reframes something that perhaps sat just below the surface of what fans could see but never quite articulate. The solo career Guy built after leaving the vocal band carried a different quality, a deepened intimacy in his performances that suggested a man who had found something real on the other side of a difficult passage. The concerts closer to home, the recordings made in that new season, the presence he brought back to his family, all of it visible now, looking back, as the fruit of a decision made in honesty and received in grace. What nobody knew was the conversation. What it cost Guy to have it, and what it cost Bill to respond the way he did, never made it into any interview or documentary. It existed only between the two of them. What Bill Gaither said at 82 was not a confession in any dramatic sense. The better word for it might be completion, the final piece of a story told in partial truths for 15 years, finally given its full shape. And what it reveals, not just about these two men, but about what genuine Christian community can look like at its best, deserves to be sat with rather than rushed past. Speaking the language of servant leadership is one thing. Living it in a moment when something you love is walking out a door, and you have the power to complicate that departure, is something else entirely. Bill Gaither did not complicate it, and Guy Penrod has carried that forward in everything he has done since. For those who have been fans since the early Homecoming days, who wore out a tape watching Guy close his eyes and lift that baritone into something that felt less like performance and more like prayer, you understand what it means when we say that some voices carry more than melody. They carry testimony. That testimony is a little more complete today than it was before. What does Bill's decision to share this say about his legacy, not just as a musician, but as a mentor and a man of faith? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because this community thinks deeply about exactly these kinds of questions. There is one more part of this story that most people have not yet connected. Bill Gaither choosing to speak about this now, at 82, in the later chapters of a ministry stretching back more than 6 decades, carries its own meaning. Those who know him well describe a man in a period of deliberate reflection, not regret, but the particular clarity that arrives when a long life begins the process of naming what mattered and why. In recent years, Bill has spoken about the Homecoming series in terms that carry that quality, talking about the artists who moved through that world and what they meant to him, about the songs that began as conversations at a kitchen table with Gloria and became part of the soundtrack of a generation's faith. He has talked more than once about carrying something that belongs, in the end, not to him but to the people it was built for, the fans, the church communities, the families who sang these songs in hospital waiting rooms, and at gravesides, and at kitchen tables of their own. Guy Penrod stood at the center of that story for nearly 15 years, his voice among the most powerful the Gaither Vocal Band ever carried. And the way their chapter together ended, privately, honestly, with a quality of grace that neither man made public, amounted to its own form of ministry. Not performed for an audience, not recorded or documented, just lived. Within the larger history of the Gaither Vocal Band, which has seen many transitions across many decades, this particular one now stands as something more than a personnel change. Voices have come and gone, generations have shifted, styles have moved, and through all of it, the ministry has continued. But what Bill's words reveal is that some of the most important things that happened within that history happened off stage, in conversations no camera captured, between people who chose honesty over image and love over institutional loyalty. That is not a small thing in any world. In the gospel world, where the distance between the message and the actual practice of it can sometimes be painfully visible, it is a genuinely rare thing. Bill Gaither has given this community an extraordinary amount across 6 decades, songs that will outlast everyone listening, a platform that brought artists to audiences who might otherwise never have found them, a vision of Christian fellowship in music that at its best was exactly what it claimed to be. What he shared recently, and the timing of when he chose to share it, belongs in that list too. The quieter gifts are sometimes the ones that last. Whatever comes next for Guy Penrod and for Bill Gaither, the fans who have followed both of them for decades already understand something about how these stories tend to go. Guy continues to perform, to record, to bring that voice into rooms where it does what it has always done, something that lives at the intersection of music and ministry, and will not be easily categorized as either one alone. And Bill at 82 keeps stewarding what he built with the faithfulness that has defined his entire public life. The question this story leaves open, though, the one worth sitting with and worth discussing, is how many other moments like this one run through the history of this ministry. How many conversations happened just off stage that shaped what fans watched on those stages, in those videos, across those decades of Homecoming recordings. How many acts of grace occurred in private that no documentary or interview ever captured, existing only between the people who were present for them. The gospel world, when it is living up to what it preaches, is full of exactly those moments. This is one of them, and the fact that it finally found its way into the light says something worth honoring about both men. If this story stayed with you, the next video will as well. The untold chapter of David Phelps's departure and return has been coming together, and what emerged from that situation is just as unexpected and in several ways even more personal than what you heard today.